What's up, everyone? It's the Autistic Scyther here, and for those that don't already know, my favorite Fire Emblem is one of my favorite video game franchises, and it's gotta be my favorite for a long time, considering how I've been playing almost every Fire Emblem game. But that being said, in terms of Fire Emblem, while Fire Emblem Awakening was the first game I ever owned a physical copy of, Fire Emblem Fates is the game I've played through the most, with Three Houses coming a close second. So that being said, since I went over my favorite Fire Emblem Awakening characters, it makes sense that I do a list of my favorite Fire Emblem Fates characters. But considering all three pathways, yeah, I'm going to do things a little different. That being said, it's time to count down my top 10 favorite Fire Emblem Fates Birthright characters. To be eligible for this list, they have to be a character who is recruitable in Fire Emblem Fates Birthright. Additionally, no Corrin, Azura, Kaze, Felicia, Jacob, or Silas on this list, since they can be recruitable in all three pathways. That being said, without further ado, let's get started. Starting off first at number 10, we have Saizo. Yep. We're starting this one off with, of course, a class that was introduced that fits the entire idea of different classes for each pathway, specifically Hoshido and Nor. And in all fairness, of course it would make sense that Hoshido would essentially give us the ninja class. And honestly, ninjas are actually pretty awesome, which, for those who haven't seen my top 10 ninjas in video games list, I put Kaze on that list. However, that being said, you gotta admit, Saizo looks pretty cool. Not only due to the fact that, like Gaijin Goomba, he's wearing blue. He's mostly wearing blue, which, for those who have seen Gaijin Goomba's Witch Ninja video, most real-life ninjas wore blue to fit in with the night sky. But with his usual fiery red hair actually fits with his fiery and serious personality, since he spends most of his time acting as a dutiful retainer to Ryoma. And he's one of the more, or dare I say, suspicious individuals of Corrin when they return to Hoshido after being in Nor for so long. Even with that, while he's kind of serious and almost willing to handle people with disdain, he's basically one of the more, or he has a bit of a softer side, especially with seen with Sakura's his support with Sakura, where he basically ends up giving her sweets, even though as thanks for helping heal him, even though he can't stand the stuff. And even with that, more often than not, Saizo is still fairly tough, to the point that after losing to Corrin in Fire Emblem Fates Revelation, he basically tries to do an effort of more or less taking them down with him by basically setting himself aflame, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, you gotta admit, all that just proves as a term of a certifiable badass. That's all I gotta say. Moving on next at number 9, we have Setsuna. Yeah, for those that already don't know, I love archers, and especially early game archers, since more often than not, whenever I use them, they tend to do very well for me and make a nice little bit of and always end up sticking around till the end. Case in point, characters like Namie, Gordon, or Rolf. That being said, yeah, Setsuna is kind of one of the most interesting ones since, well, she's basically of royal blood due to coming from a more royal family. But considering how she's Hinoka's retainer, yeah, it's kind of a... You definitely get to see it in terms of their personalities. Especially due to Setsuna being kind of aloof and scatterbrained. And I know a lot of people tend to hate the fact that Setsuna's main thing is that she keeps falling into traps. But honestly, I mean, while it is a little annoying, it's kind of fun to see in terms of her. And especially in terms of Hinoka being the more driven and dedicated of the Hoshidan royal family. And it does make some sense, as it turns out that Hinoka is mostly mentioned to put out Setsuna's clothes for her every morning because she's so scatterbrained. But even with that, she does prove to be pretty skilled, especially despite her being scatterbrained, as her supports with Azama shows that she can be a pretty good chef when she wants to, if she's not thinking all that much. And heck, even with Arthur, and even in her supports with Arthur, she's still able to basically hold off dragons at bay, which really does say a lot. Oh boy, you're gonna see more about Arthur later on, I guarantee it. But even with that, it still proves a lot of fun. Just saying. Moving on next at number 8, we have Hayato. Oh boy, yeah. This one's gonna be very controversial because everyone hates Hayato. And considering how he's somewhat of a follow-up of Riken, who basically he is more or less a member of the Shepherds, but he wants to be seen as more of an adult rather than just a tag-along kid, and he does so by essentially helping rescue Maribel as a result. Hayato, on the other hand, he's mostly just proven himself to try, and his main thing is just trying to prove that he's not a kid, but he's basically an adult. Which apparently is something that a lot of people tend to hate. And the fact that we have Lysithea in Fire Emblem 3 Houses, who does the exact same thing as Hayato, but is loved more than Hayato, is really making no sense to me. But even with that, Hayato just proves to be pretty skilled. And the fact that he's basically a respected member of the Wind Tribe village, to the point that he proves to most of his efforts have him just basically still trying to be more adult, so no one, and so he doesn't end up getting treated like a kid because of the things he likes, really says a lot. And naturally, that has an interesting sort of feeling, as shown in many of his supports. Case in point being characters like Sakura, his supports with characters like Sakura, Hana, and Nyx, which definitely show an interesting amount of effort. I mean, I mean, even Mozu to an extent, which again says a lot. But even with that, Hayato still proves how strong he can be, and he's more or less one of the more surprising mages in Fates as a whole. Which really does say a lot when you consider that Fates mages aren't too long-lasting due to their kind of squishy exteriors. I wish mages were somewhat better. Moving on next, at number 7, we have Scarlet. And surprisingly enough, while Scarlet is basically a Norian unit, she's recruitable in Fire Emblem Fates Birthright. And considering how I'm playing through Fire Emblem Fates Birthright in an Iron Man playthrough, it basically gave me me to realize that I've been sleeping on Scarlet for the longest time. Which really does say a lot, especially since she's your only Wyvern rider in Birthright. And basically she's a strong unit. Since she's basically the leader of a resistance group in Chev, and she joins your group to help you out. And she becomes one of your best units, especially due to being a solid axe unit. And naturally, really does say a lot. Granted, most of the time, most people will swap over the killer axe to someone like, I don't know, Rinka or Charlotte. But honestly, Scarlet proves to be one of the better units. It's for that. And she's lasted a lot longer than I normally thought. That being said, I wish she had a support with Ryoma and wasn't just able to support Corrin. Yeah. Honestly, there really is something there that intelligence system should have thought of. But I digress. I really do. Moving on next, at number 6, we have Orochi. Speaking of units that are better than I expected, honestly, Orochi's one of the more interesting characters that has her own style and flair that can be added to any army. And this is really saying a lot since she starts off as one of Mikoto's retainers, as well as just being a happy-go-lucky young woman who more or less focuses more on the more fortune-teller aspects of her craft, which really does say a lot. But even with that, she's still willing to joke around with everybody, as seen with her supports with Odin / Owain, and how she's able to trick him into doing her shopping for her in order to help fix his mojo. But even with that, but even with her aspect of utilizing trickery, more often than not, her supports really do have a sort of interesting effort. Again, bring up a support like her support with Takumi, where she more or less just flat out ribs him about playing with dolls as a child, which he basically just tries to tell her to stop, not to tell anyone about it. And even to a point of mentioning about Saizo almost wetting himself when she met him as a child, and to the point and threatening to tell everyone, only to get him to tell them as a result. And he's mad about that. However, the big reason I prefer Witch Orochi is OP. Just Nosferatu, Warp. Honestly, it is just... I don't know if they noticed, but that's just broken. And I've used her more often than not as a witch. So yeah, I know. This will be continued in part 2.